Okay, hello everyone in the room and also in Zoom. My name is Annika Hasselblad and I'm a PhD student here at Mid Sweden University in Sundsvall. And 2.5 years ago, I started this journey towards becoming a doctor, and now I'm halfway through. And I started as a newly examinated engineer in industrial economics and management. So today I'm going to present to you my licentiate thesis called Values Behind Welfare Technologies and Their Possible Realization. And here I want to talk about values that exist behind welfare technologies among the actors and how these values are realized. And I also want to create a technology evaluation method that can be used by care practices. So the term digitalization, I think almost everyone or every one of you have heard it. And the Swedish government is putting a lot of money into digitalization. For example, in 2018, 48 billion Swedish crowns was invested to digitalization in the digitalization budget. And this can be almost equal to the Swedish military defense, which is 50 billion Swedish crowns, or the civil protection and administration of justice, which is the police, fire and rescue operation, which is 62 billion Swedish crowns. So the Swedish government is investing a lot of money in digitalization, and the strategy is that Sweden will be the best in the world to use the possibilities of digitalization. So we see digitalization as our future. So when I started, I got the assignment to look into digitalization and also what values that comes with it. But I needed to delimit my research object. So I chose something called welfare technologies. And welfare technologies are, as you can see, different types of technologies often used in elderly care or impairment cares by nurses, which is care workers, but also by elderly and their relatives. And these types of technologies can be, for example, planning systems, cameras or alarms, but also more social technologies such as robotic kittens and video solutions and communication tools that the elderly can use to contact their relatives. And there are mainly two different motivations for using welfare technologies. One is the demographic problem, which is the problem that the elderly population is getting older. So we have a higher amount of elderly above 85 years old. And at the same time, we don't have enough educated caregivers. So here's where welfare technologies are to step in and support the caregivers to give equal quality care. And also another motivation is the increasing quality of life. So by, for example, using welfare technologies, elderly can stay in their home for a longer period of time and don't have to move into a care home. But welfare technologies has gotten critique. For example, it has been shown that instead of making the care more efficient, it has produced stress by adding more administrative work and forced the caregivers to have a more technology knowledge. And also that it's being misused and therefore contradicting its own actual purpose. It has shown that it has threatened the caregiver's own definition of what good care is by shifting the perception towards performance-based values. And Frenet identified that the elderly care organizations are at risk to become victims for something called technology determinism. And in short, technology determinism is the aim to pursue the latest technologies and maybe not the best solution. So as I chose welfare technologies to be my research object, I identified 3 different actors that are related to welfare technologies. We have the users, which can be both caregivers, patients, and their relatives. But from the previous critique, I identify users as the caregivers. And also we have the designers, which are often engineers or computer scientists, which is what I represent. I'm an educated engineer. And also we have the decision maker, which is managers and politics, the ones that decides what welfare technology to implement where. And I want to talk a little bit about the concepts of values and assumptions. Values and assumptions the values are the fundamental driving force behind decisions and actions. And to illustrate what this means, I take a bed sensor example told by a dear colleague of mine. A couple of nurses wanted a bed sensor that would alarm when the elderly has wet their bed, so they needed when to change their underwear. So a couple of engineers developed a bed sensor that was highly sensitive, almost too sensitive. So even when the slightest drop of sweat came from the elderly's back, the bed sensor alarmed. So the elderly care personnel had to go and change underwear too often, even when it wasn't even needed. And this means that when they told this to the engineers, they didn't understand what was wrong with the bed sensor. It was the best of its kind. It was as sensitive as it possibly could be. So here we have a value in differentiations between the two professions. The engineers, they wanted a sensitive sensor, which was the best, but the nurses just wanted a good functionality. So here we have a value in differentiation. And also that the designers made assumptions about what the users really wanted. So we have the different professions are characterized by different values as they derive from different knowledge traditions. And for this thesis, the purpose and aim is sectioned into two parts. The first part is aimed to investigate and understand these values and assumptions among welfare technologies from these three different actors. The second part is to create an evaluation tool that can control the effect, so we know when the welfare technology was successful or not, both from economics aspects, but also by using the user perspective. The research questions that I ask is how can we understand the values and assumptions behind welfare technology, design, implementation, and usage in a deeper sense? And for the second part, I ask how can we ensure that the design corresponds to the needs of the users? So I want to talk a little bit about my philosophical points of departure when writing this thesis. Which grounds in the history of technology development. A technology philosopher called Feinberg talks about modernity. And in very short, modernity is how we lay progress, how progress lays its promises in technology. So progress in the society is strongly connected to technology. And he also mentioned two different viewpoints, determinism and humanism, where determinism represented by the more positivistic traditions, such as me as an engineer, see technology as something neutral, independent from its context. For example, this pen, you see the pen as just a pen. And in comparison, humanism see technology as something dependent on its context, and therefore it also have a political impact. So this pen is dependent on me as a user and how I use it. And as I derive from determinism, I want to step out of that and kind of take in some knowledge from the more humanistic perspective and look upon my own methodologies. So I use something called social construction of technology, which is a critique toward this technology determinism. And also, we talk today about something called measurement culture. The culture that we want to measure everything. And two extremes of this is something called dataism or digital positivism, which is the focus on data quantity and maybe not the quality, meaning that if we have a huge amount of data, we can represent the reality with it. So, and in the public sector, we have something called new public management, which is the belief in economic rationality to create a more effective public sector according to performance targets. So by using measurement, we can make a more efficient public sector, more looking like a private sector company. And when I continue to relate to this techno-economic view, I use Avgirou's terminology, techno-economic rationality, which is related to a rationalistic perspective in combination with the advances of technology and capital. And also, new public management has been shown in today's modern welfare societies to be prominent. And also it has shown to not have such a good effects as it focused too much on the performance measurement and not the quality of the service. So if we go back to this picture where we have welfare technology and the three actors, the user, designer, and decision makers, and we take the three different professions or knowledge traditions, they all derive from different values. And this is the thesis for this, the hypothesis for this thesis, which is that caregivers derive from humanity or individuality by giving each and every patient specific care. So each situation is individual. And the engineer and computer scientists derive from a more techno-economic rationality, meaning that we focus on technology that can provide an economic or profitable solution, and also focus on being rational. And also we have the management or politics that derive from management values, which is characterized by this new public management movement, focusing on performance targets. So from this, I created an analytical framework that is based upon Orlikowski's structural model of technology. And here we have the three actors: decision maker, user, and designer, and the technology, which is in this case is welfare technologies. And we also have two arrows between them. And the arrow characterizes relationships between the actors and the technology. So for example, arrow A is that technology is always a product of human action. So me, as a creator of this pen, I always inscribe certain values in it. For example, that I want it to be light, fast, cheap, and such kind of values. And also arrow B is the other way around, that technology is a medium of human action. So me as a user, I describe this pen, and for me, it maybe not even be a pen, it can be a hammer or a dart arrow, or whatever I want, because I describe it and interpreted it. So for the methodology, which is also sectioned into two parts, I have a more interpretative approach in the first part, focusing on understanding welfare technologies. What are the conceptions about welfare technologies and how do we define it? And in the second part, I take on a more pragmatic approach and try to solve how can we make sure that welfare technologies actually contribute with good effects. And also the analytical part is, as I previously presented, the structural model of technology, and also something called trivial measure fixation, which I will explain a little bit later. So for part one, and paper one, I investigate welfare technology conceptions. So how do we conceive it? What is it? Both in policy and practice. I have done a literature research and a policy analysis together with the survey. The survey was handed out to nursing students, engineering students, and primary care managers. And these three are to represent the three different actors. The result shows one narrow and one wide conception of what welfare technologies are. So the narrow one, meaning that welfare technologies can only be used in elderly care and very specific situation, more related to an individual perspective and a humanistic way of seeing knowledge traditions. And also the wide conception is more related to a generalizing picture of what welfare technologies are. That we need to, that welfare technologies are technologies that can be implemented in many different situations and therefore more profitable and usable. For paper two, I compare two different definitions of what welfare technologies are and compare it to an industrial and a welfare society ideal type. And I use these two ideal types as the industrial society characterizes this a more positivistic way of seeing the world. And also it contains values such as streamlining, efficiency, profit, and how we can focus on economic values. While an ideal welfare society is more characterized by solidarity and support and safety. So the result shows that the two definitions, one created by the IT and telecom companies, which is a group of IT and telecom companies, more representative of the designer, as they are engineers or computer scientists. They are more characterized by economic rationality values, while this definition by the Swedish Auxiliary Institute, which is a public organization representing the user of welfare technology, this is much more represented by welfare values. So to the second part, the method that I've used in the second part, the more solution-based approach, I use design science and combine multi-criteria decision analysis and data envelopment analysis to create an evaluation method. And the method is aimed to be used before a welfare technology implementation and after the welfare technology implementation to know what was the effects. Was it, did it improve the care situation or did it make it worse? And the methodology contributes with a score called TIES, Technology Implementation Evaluation Score, which is a combination of different data types. And here is a picture of the TIES model. We have decision analysis in the first step, combining different types of input data. And also by comparing scenarios before and after, the data envelopment analysis creates a ranked list to know if the scenario before or after was better or worse. So here's an example of the input data that I used, which is statistics, patient data, such as opinions and assessments, and caregiver opinions and assessments. So I combine both quantitative input data with qualitative input data, so that we both know the economical aspect, but also the user perspective and the designer perspective. So this is the trivial measure fixation model. And in this case, we have a traditional performance indicator only using statistical data. And by only using a small amount of statistical data, the indicator can have a quite large validity problem, as it doesn't represent reality. We measure something that we believe that we measure. For example, how digitalized we are, and we measure the amount of technologies. Is that really representable, or do we need more information to be able to evaluate it? So by using TIES instead and combine this traditional performance indicator with more subjective and qualitative data from the user and from the user perspective, we can decrease this validity problem a little. Maybe not, of course not totally, but we can at least make it a little bit more fitting to reality, and therefore also decrease the level of unintended consequences that it creates. So the conclusions from this thesis is that I have provided an understanding about the differentiation among definitions of welfare technologies, and also that there are differences between how the users and how the designers see what technologies, welfare technologies are. And also that there are a wide varying range of conceptions of what it is. And I also have provided an evaluation method to control the effects of welfare technologies, shown to involve not only economical aspects, but also user data. And the contributions are that I have provided knowledge regarding values among actors in relation to welfare technologies, and also this evaluation methodology that can be used by care practices in the future. But the biggest contribution I believe that I've done is moving towards other types of knowledge traditions, more humanistic traditions, to gather new information and new knowledge and apply that on my own methodologies and understanding. So this means that the results shows that we need to involve the users and trusting the knowledge of the profession, even in our indicators and in our evaluation methodologies. So that was everything from me, and thank you for listening. And I would love to answer all your questions.